George Harrison was known as the Quiet Beatle, but behind his calm exterior burned a fiery soul. He was spiritual, sensitive, and deeply loyal. But when someone crossed him, his anger could last a lifetime. For years, fans saw him as the peaceful one, the man who sought enlightenment in India and wrote songs about love and God. But what few realized was that George carried one of the most painful betrayals in rock history, one that cut deeper than fame, music, or money. It wasn't a feud with John or Paul this time. It was something far more personal and far more shocking. The man George Harrison came to truly hate was someone he once considered a brother, guitarist and singer Eric Clapton. What Clapton did nearly destroyed their friendship forever, and for years, George couldn't even speak his name without emotion flooding back. Yet somehow, out of that heartbreak came one of the greatest comebacks in music history. A story of forgiveness, strength, and the kind of love that no one saw coming. Because this isn't just a story of betrayal, it's a story of redemption, of how George Harrison lost everything to the man he trusted most, and still found a way to forgive him, make music with him again, and even share the stage with him years later. This is the untold story of the betrayal that broke George Harrison's heart, and the incredible comeback that proved he was, after all, the Beatle with the biggest soul. In the late 1960s, George Harrison and Eric Clapton were inseparable. Both were quiet, introspective guitarists who spoke the same language. Music. They admired each other's work, shared spiritual ideas, and found comfort in each other's company amid the chaos of fame. Clapton often called George a true brother, and George once said Eric was the only other guitarist who truly understood me. Their bond began during the height of the Beatles' fame, when Clapton was making waves with Cream. In 1968, the two collaborated on While My Guitar Gently Weeps, one of the most haunting tracks on the White Album. It was George's idea to bring Eric into the session, something unheard of for the Beatles, who rarely let outsiders play on their records. Clapton's emotional solo elevated the song and their friendship to legendary status. Offstage, the two men often spent evenings jamming together, laughing, and confiding in one another. But beneath that brotherly connection, something darker was brewing, a tension neither of them could fully control. At the heart of it all was Pattie Boyd, George Harrison's wife and one of the most beautiful and iconic women of the era. Pattie had inspired George's timeless love song, Something, a track Frank Sinatra once called the greatest love song ever written. But behind the music, their marriage was crumbling. George was drifting spiritually, consumed by meditation and religion, while Pattie felt neglected and lonely. It was during this fragile time that Eric Clapton, George's closest friend, fell deeply in love with her. At first, Clapton tried to hide his feelings. He and George were so close that confessing the truth felt impossible. But his love soon turned into obsession. He poured his anguish into his music, most famously in the song Layla, a desperate, passionate cry for the woman he couldn't have. Layla was Pattie. Every riff, every lyric was a secret message to George's wife. When George found out, he was devastated. Not only had his best friend fallen for his wife, but he had written one of the most famous rock songs in history about it. To George, it felt like betrayal in its purest form. Still, in typical Harrison fashion, he didn't explode with anger. He retreated into silence. Friends say George's response was cold, but composed. He didn't yell, one recalled. He just said, "Well, good luck to you both," and walked away. For years, the triangle between George, Pattie, and Eric tore at all three of them. George and Pattie's marriage deteriorated beyond repair, and Clapton's love for her consumed him. He spiraled into addiction, writing songs like Bell Bottom Blues and Have You Ever Loved a Woman? All reflections of his inner torment. By 1974, the inevitable happened. George and Patty divorced. Not long after, Patty began a relationship with Clapton. The betrayal was now complete. Most men would never forgive something like that. But George Harrison wasn't most men. Beneath the pain, his spirituality and wisdom wouldn't allow him to hate forever. Still, the wound ran deep, and their friendship, once so strong, was shattered. When asked years later if he resented Clapton, George simply said, "He fell in love with my wife. What can I do? These things happen. Better him than some stranger." It was a statement of acceptance. But behind those words was a story of heartbreak few could imagine. Yet this wasn't the end of their story. In an almost impossible twist of fate, George and Eric would find their way back to each other, not as rivals, but as brothers once again. And when the world least expected it, they would share the stage, proving that forgiveness can outshine even the deepest betrayal. After Patty Boyd left George Harrison and moved in with Eric Clapton, the music world erupted. It wasn't just a personal affair, it was the scandal of rock and roll. Two of the most respected guitarists in history, once inseparable, were now linked in one of the most famous love triangles of all time. Fans couldn't believe it. The press hounded all three of them, turning their private heartbreak into public spectacle. For George, it was an emotional blow unlike any other. The man he had considered a brother had taken the love of his life. Yet, even in pain, George refused to retaliate. Those closest to him said that instead of lashing out, he turned inward, meditating, writing, and seeking peace through his spiritual beliefs. He once remarked to a friend, "If I don't forgive, I'll just carry it forever. And I don't want that weight." Still, the tension between George and Eric was undeniable. They would occasionally cross paths at concerts or recording sessions, but the warmth between them had vanished. Every glance carried the unspoken history of what had happened. Eric, now living with Patty, was haunted by guilt. His dream had come true, but it came at a cost he couldn't ignore. By the mid-1970s, both men were walking different paths. George was focusing on his solo career, exploring spirituality through his All Things Must Pass album, a masterpiece born out of pain and reflection. Eric, meanwhile, was wrestling with addiction, his once brilliant career slipping through his fingers. Patty, caught between them, admitted years later that she loved both men deeply, but never wanted to destroy their friendship. One of the most fascinating things about George Harrison was his ability to see beyond ego. While others in his position might have let hatred define them, George slowly began to let go. Friends said he often joked about the situation, even making light of it during parties. At one gathering years later, he reportedly introduced Patty and Eric by saying, "I used to be married to her, but she preferred the other guitarist." The room laughed. But behind that humor was a rare kind of grace. But even forgiveness couldn't erase the hurt completely. George poured his emotions into his music, often writing songs filled with melancholy and longing. So Sad, one of his most emotional ballads, reflected the pain of losing Patty and the emptiness that followed. His lyrics spoke of confusion, heartbreak, and the struggle to find meaning when love turns to loss. Meanwhile, Eric's relationship with Patty began to show cracks. The romance that had once burned so intensely started to fade under the weight of addiction and fame. Patty later confessed that, though she loved Eric, she often missed the calm and spirituality she had once shared with George. The irony was painful. She had left one man searching for love, only to find herself lost in another's chaos. Years passed. George and Eric rarely spoke, but neither man publicly attacked the other. Time had softened the edges of their rivalry. Then, in the early 1980s, something unexpected happened. Fate brought them back together. It began with mutual friends and charity events. Slowly, Cautiously, the two started to reconnect. Music, the same force that had once bonded them, became their bridge once more. When they finally shared a stage again, the audience held its breath, unsure if it would be awkward or magical. But as soon as their guitars began to harmonize, the past seemed to fade. The notes they played weren't just sounds. They were confessions, apologies, and forgiveness woven into melody. It was as if both men were saying, without words, "We've been through it all, and we're still here." George Harrison had every reason to hate Eric Clapton, but instead he chose to rise above it, proving that true strength isn't in revenge, but in peace. And when Eric looked across the stage and saw George smiling back at him, he knew that some friendships were meant to survive even the deepest wounds. By the late 1980s, George Harrison and Eric Clapton had lived through storms that would have broken most friendships forever. But what made their story remarkable wasn't the betrayal. It was the healing that followed. The years had changed both men. The wild parties, the addictions, and the heartbreaks had faded into the background, replaced by perspective and humility. George, after years of introspection and spiritual searching, had found peace in simplicity. He wasn't chasing fame anymore. Instead, he spent his days in the quiet English countryside, gardening, recording music when inspiration struck, and embracing a more private life. Eric, on the other hand, had gone through his own reckoning. After battling his demons, he had emerged sober and grounded, realizing how much damage his choices had caused, not only to himself, but to the people he loved most. When their paths crossed again, it wasn't at a glitzy party or recording studio. It was at a charity event. The tension that once defined their relationship was gone, replaced by a deep, unspoken understanding. They had both suffered, both lost, and both grown. When they finally spoke, it wasn't about the past, but about life, about how strange it was to survive everything and still find themselves connected. What happened next was something fans never expected. In the early 1990s, George invited Eric to join him on his Japanese tour, an extraordinary gesture that proved forgiveness wasn't just words to him. It was action. The announcement stunned the music world. Two men who had once been rivals were now going to share the stage night after night. It was unthinkable, and yet deeply fitting. From the very first show, the chemistry was undeniable. George's calm, meditative presence balanced Eric's raw, bluesy energy. They weren't competing anymore. They were complementing each other. During performances of songs like Something and While My Guitar Gently Weeps, fans could feel the emotion, not just in the music, but in the bond between the two men. Eric later described those concerts as a spiritual experience. He said George wasn't just a musician, he was a teacher. He had this light about him, Clapton recalled. Even after everything that happened between us, he made me feel forgiven. That's something I'll carry forever. Backstage, their conversations were easy and filled with laughter. They reminisced about the old days, the early Beatles years, the late-night jam sessions, the chaos of fame. And, surprisingly, even joked about the past. George, ever the philosopher, once teased Eric by saying, "You know, if you wanted her that badly, you could have just asked." The room erupted in laughter, and in that moment, decades of tension melted away. But beneath the humor was something deeper: mutual respect. Both men knew that what they shared was rare. A bond forged in fire, tested by heartbreak, but rebuilt on the foundation of forgiveness. For George, letting go of anger wasn't a weakness. It was his greatest act of strength. And for Eric, being allowed back into George's life was one of the greatest gifts he ever received. Their friendship during those final years became something beautiful. Calm, respectful, and rooted in gratitude. Eric often visited George at his home in Friar Park, where they would sit in the garden, drink tea, and talk about everything except fame. They had finally found peace, both with each other and within themselves. When the Japanese tour ended, George publicly thanked Eric for being part of it. "He's my best friend," George said during an interview. "We've been through a lot, but that's what makes it real. The audience, the world, and even the media who once thrived on their feud now saw a different story, one not about rivalry, but redemption." What had begun as a painful betrayal had transformed into one of the most powerful examples of forgiveness in music history. But the story wasn't quite over. When tragedy struck years later, Eric Clapton would once again prove that his bond with George went far beyond the stage, straight into the heart of legacy and brotherhood. As the 1990s faded into the new millennium, George Harrison had found what he had always been searching for: peace. After years of fame, heartbreak, and spiritual discovery, he finally settled into a quiet rhythm of life at his beloved home, Friar Park. He had a loving wife, Olivia, and a son, Donnie, who shared his gentle spirit. His days were spent tending to his garden, playing music only when he felt inspired, and surrounding himself with people who brought him calm rather than chaos. But behind that serenity, George was fighting a silent battle. In 1997, he was diagnosed with throat cancer, a result of years of smoking. True to his nature, he faced it with grace and calm acceptance, saying simply, "Everyone has to die sometime. It's just a change of clothes." He continued to live quietly, refusing to let illness define him. Yet as his condition worsened, his circle of friends grew smaller, but stronger. And one of those friends was Eric Clapton. Eric, by now a father and a changed man, had never forgotten what George had done for him, not only forgiving the past, but welcoming him back into his life as a brother. When he learned that George was ill, Eric quietly stepped in, handling many of the details of his care, protecting his privacy from the press, and visiting him often. Those close to them said Eric was deeply emotional during those visits, humbled by George's peace and humor, even in pain. "He was so calm," Eric recalled later. "He knew where he was going. He didn't fear it." When George passed away on November 29, 2001, at the age of 58, the world fell silent. The news struck deep. The Beatles weren't just musicians. They were part of people's lives, their memories. But for Eric Clapton, it wasn't the loss of a legend. It was the loss of family. In the months that followed, Eric took it upon himself to organize a memorial unlike any other, a celebration of George's life through the language they both loved most: music. On November 29, 2002, exactly 1 year after George's passing, the concert for George was held at the Royal Albert Hall in London. Eric personally curated every detail, ensuring that the night reflected George's humor, humility, and spirituality. It was a gathering of legends: Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr, Tom Petty, Jeff Lynne, and Ravi Shankar's daughter, Anushka. But at the center of it all stood Eric Clapton, quiet and composed, leading the band with the same care and devotion George had once shown him. When Eric performed "While My Guitar Gently Weeps" alongside Paul, his voice cracked with emotion. You could feel the pain, love, and gratitude in every note. It wasn't just a performance. It was a farewell. During the concert, Eric spoke softly about George's unique ability to forgive and love without ego. "He taught me that we're all connected," Eric said. "Even when we think we're apart, we're not." That night, tears filled the eyes of every person in the audience. They weren't just mourning George Harrison, the Beatle, they were honoring George Harrison, the man who had turned betrayal into friendship and conflict into compassion. The bond between George and Eric didn't end with death. In interviews over the years, Eric has often said that he still feels George's presence. "Sometimes I'll be playing and I swear I can feel him beside me," he once confessed. "He had this light, and I think it's still shining." George Harrison's story wasn't one of revenge or resentment. It was a masterclass in forgiveness. He showed the world that love can survive even the deepest wounds, and that peace isn't something you find. It's something you choose. In the end, Eric Clapton didn't just lose a friend. He lost the man who had changed his soul. And as the final chords of Something echoed through the Royal Albert Hall that night, every person there understood that this was more than a goodbye. It was a reminder that love, music, and forgiveness live forever.